What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an overview of the origin characters in Baldur's Gate 3, including what origin characters are, some important things to note about them, including some details about the origin characters available to us at the launch version of the game. So a lot to discuss here. I do want to mention at the beginning, though, when I get to the part where I'm talking about the specific origin characters, it's hard to really give you an introduction to that character without telling you a little bit of their story. And while I won't be discussing anything that isn't public marketing for them, if you want to go in completely blind, do know that I am, outside of just explaining how they work and what they are mechanically, going to be talking about their stories a bit. Now, to kick this video off formally, I think it's best to start talking about what an origin character is, because to say it is just a companion really wouldn't be telling you the full story. You see, origin characters are absolutely companions, but they can also serve as your own player character. You can play through the game with any of the characters we're about to talk about as your main character. With the exception of one of them, this means that character is a preset. They are going to have a set character with a set background, obviously. And we'll touch on their class here in just a little bit, so we'll circle back around to that. Another thing that sets these characters apart, though, is that they're not simply a companion with an interesting side story, but rather all of their stories are tied to varying degrees with the main plot of the game. They will all concern themselves with the main plot as their story is tied to it. And while you are not playing an origin character, this will follow a sort of default path, decisions they will make on their own without your input. However, if you are playing that origin character, you'll be able to make those decisions for them. And while they are not your main character, you'll be able to influence said decisions. It's very likely if you are playing as said character, you will get to make unique choices that wouldn't be available otherwise. This is actually something we saw Larian do with their previous game, Original Sin 2, which also used this origin character system. There were options you really wouldn't see unless you were playing the game with those origin characters. And that, combined with their personal story tied to the main plot, makes them a pretty unique thing, beyond just being a regular old companion. Another important thing to note about origin characters, though, is their class. You see, ultimately, this is not Original Sin 2, where the origin characters would be able to basically fill any role you want and could be built any which way. The origin characters in Baldur's Gate 3 have very specific stories tied to their background and their class. Shadowheart, for instance, story revolves around her being a cleric of Shar. Her story simply wouldn't make sense otherwise. So because of this, I find it incredibly unlikely you'll be able to completely redo these characters' classes, and if I had to guess, which is absolutely what we have to do until the game launches, as we have received no official confirmation on this, at least one level of these characters will likely have to be in their sort of set class, with you potentially being able to multi-class them into something else later. That said, though, that's just a best guess and sort of a best possible outcome, really, because it's also possible they simply won't let us change their classes at all. But because of the way their story works and their classes work, it's almost guaranteed you won't be able to re-roll them completely, so to speak. That said, before we start moving on to specific introductions, the last thing I want to mention here is, what if you don't like any of these characters? What about that? Well, you're not completely out of luck. The game will be coming with 12 hirelings they have confirmed, which are simply customizable characters, one for each class, that you'll be able to take on as party members that don't have a story or anything, which will allow you to make a custom party that doesn't have to deal with any of these people if you don't like them. Furthermore, in addition to origin characters, we will get at least 4 confirmed regular companions, that is to say, people that will be joining us on our adventure with their own story, that we simply can't play as our main character. So if you don't wind up liking any of these characters, you absolutely still have some options. Truth be told, many of these characters dying is absolutely part of the roleplay. If you don't like any of them and you want to kill any of them in certain situations, that's a very viable and legitimate option. So keep that in mind. Now from here, I want to get into the origin characters themselves, sort of introduce them a bit, as well as what to expect from them. We're going to start with the most unique one of all of them because it's more of a concept than a character, and this is the Dark Urge, the most recently announced of the origin characters, but we will nonetheless keep this one a little brief because I made an entirely separate full video on this one due to its recent announcement. What makes the Dark Urge unique though is that unlike all of the other origin characters, this is not a set character, but rather it is a customizable race class combo of whatever you want tied to a specific backstory, which in the Dark Urge's case is that they have amnesia and they've come to with an extreme urge to kill on top of the regular Mind Flayer tadpole that has infected everyone else, which is what has brought you all together to begin with. Now, what this urge is and what we know about it is very likely to be one particular thing, but I will leave that to my full video on it to cover if you should so choose, as that one is actually probably more spoilery than the rest of these. That though brings us to number 2, and this is Astarion, our high elf vampire, more specifically a vampire spawn, who just so happens to also be a rogue. Astarion has spent the last couple of centuries as a vampire spawn, that is to say, a lesser vampire beholden to a true vampire, having only recently escaped through events that are rather murky, only to be found by Mind Flayers and infected with a tadpole. Astarion is, unsurprisingly, not so trusting of others. Centuries ago, though, before he was a vampire spawn, he was a magistrate in the city of Baldur's Gate before being turned into a vampire spawn. Having only recently gained his freedom, his master is desperate to get him back, which is causing all sorts of problems, which is about as much as you need to know about Astarion to get you started. But another interesting thing about this that I want to talk about is that vampire spawns and vampires are a distinct thing in Dungeons & Dragons. Now, don't get me wrong, for all intents and purposes, a vampire spawn is effectively a vampire, but right out of the gate, they actually lack free will. A true vampire will turn a person into a vampire spawn, which is effectively the vampire's servant and lacks free will. However, it's possible for this to change. If their master dies, they will gain their free will, or if the vampire spawn drinks blood from their master, they will also then gain their free will and also become a true vampire at the same time. Now, the exact details of that in Dungeons & Dragons are left a little vague for the sake of storytelling, I would imagine, but it's an interesting distinction that I think is worth noting when it comes to Astarion, and I imagine how all that plays out and the specifics of it will involve his personal story, so that's probably good enough for an introduction. Next up, though, we have the human wizard Gale. Like other characters, Gale has other problems besides just the tadpole kicking around in his brain. You see, Gale used to be a very powerful archmage in the city of Waterdeep, it so happens, but he's obviously since had a bit of a fall from grace when he had a very dramatic falling out with the goddess of magic, Mystra. We actually know a few more details in regards to this, but I'm going to keep it vague for the sake of spoilers. What's important to know, though, is that as a result of this falling out, Gale was cursed with a magic orb that consumes magical energy. Basically, if Gale doesn't keep this thing fed and happy, it will explode, killing him and much of the surrounding area. A sort of magical bomb, if you will. So needless to say, his personal story will revolve around dealing with that situation and likely his role with the relationship he has with Mystra. But that brings us to number 3 with Lae'zel, the Githyanki fighter. Lae'zel is a little more immediately directly tied to the main story, simply by the virtue of being a Githyanki infected with a Mind Flayer tadpole. You see, the Mind Flayers as a race used to enslave a race called the Gith for centuries, before the Gith rose up and overthrew the Mind Flayers. However, afterwards, they suffered a bit of an ideological split, which fractured them into the Githzerai and the Githyanki. The Githyanki being a more evil-oriented militant group, with the Githzerai being more peaceful and monastic. So, as it might come as no surprise to you, the evil Githyanki are absolutely zealous in their hatred for Mind Flayers, so Lae'zel's situation is unacceptable to her. She is seeking a way to immediately deal with this, which their kind have, as they've dealt with the Mind Flayers for a very long period of time. Add on this Lae'zel's eagerness to prove her worthiness to the Githyanki Queen, Queen Vlaakith, and you've got some pretty clear, if straightforward, motivations for her specifically. While that's really all you need to know about Lae'zel going into this, I do want to real quick note before we move on. There is a ton of lore around the Gith and the Mind Flayer specifically and a lot of their interactions. And while I wouldn't say you need to know any of that going into Baldur's Gate 3, it does make for a really interesting read if you're looking to learn more about the setting and everything ahead of the game. Next up, however, we have Shadowheart, the half-elf cleric of Shar. We meet her very early on as she is also trapped aboard the Mind Flayer ship as we go to escape, and she's one of the first people we run into afterwards. Like everyone else, she has been infected with that tadpole and is willing to join forces with us to solve the situation. However, Shadowheart in particular has a very shadowy mission going on the side, because if you're unfamiliar with the lore, the goddess Shar, of which she is a cleric, is the goddess of darkness and loss, or absence even. And it just so happens Shadowheart was on a mission in service of her goddess when all of this went down, and because of this, Shadowheart is in possession of a rather strange relic of Gith origin. But beyond that, even Shadowheart herself is having trouble telling you what's going on, simply because Shadowheart, as a ritualistic part of her mission, was stripped of her memories ahead of time outside of like basic information. So when Shadowheart completes her mission, she could get her memories back. Shadowheart also has a very direct tie to the main story, like right away, that I also don't want to spoil here, but suffice to say, she has many motivations for her very secretive behavior, not the least of which is the simple fact that she is a cleric of Shar. But then we have Wyll, our human warlock. So it's a little bit harder to give you an introduction for Wyll because they only recently announced that they were actually rewriting the character a little bit. So while some of what he says in the current early access period isn't really probably going to be representative, they did, however, update his bio on the official game website, which I'll likely have on screen here, which is probably the best introduction you can have to this character at the moment, simply because, again, what we have access to in early access simply isn't accurate due to the rewrites that he's getting. Best current information is that Wyll was drawn into a warlock's pact with a being known as Mazora in order for him to save people's lives as a monster hunter known as the Blade of Frontiers. However, in exchange for the power to do this, Mazora is making him track down her enemies, which so far have simply been other devilish creatures. But needless to say, pacts like this are fickle, and he's looking to get out of the deal before it costs him more than he's willing to pay. Another interesting note about Wyll is that he is going to be desperately wanting to kill our next origin character that we'll talk about momentarily, and you'll have to resolve that situation in some way, potentially forcing it to not happen, letting it happen, whatever floats your boat. But something to note for sure. Another thing I wanted to mention here, though, is that a common misconception about warlocks is that their power is tied to their patron as part of their warlock pact, period, and that the patron can rescind that power after it's given. And that's actually not true. The power given to a warlock by their patron isn't something that can be taken away. However, in exchange for this power, a warlock makes a pact with the entity giving them this power. So if a warlock doesn't fulfill their end of the bargain, it might become hazardous to their health, but they won't actually lose any power. So I'm curious to see what Larian does with this story as a whole, especially with the rewrites, because the way warlock pacts work in Dungeons & Dragons leaves a lot of opportunity for role-playing, and the specifics are typically left up to the player and the dungeon master, which in this case is you and Larian. And as my own personal favorite class as warlocks, I'm just, again, curious to see what they wind up doing with this, especially since he was being rewritten because his initial early access story was a little boring, to be honest. That, though, does finally bring us to our final origin character with Karlach, the Barbarian Tiefling. Karlach was also only recently announced, but she was available to talk to in early access previously. You just weren't able to recruit her, and you weren't under the impression that she was an origin character. Her inclusion here was, again, very recent. And in fact, her quest that she was involved in early access prior to this knowledge was one of the more interesting ones to begin with, because you see, Karlach is an escapee from a literal plane of hell known as Avernus, the first layer. The ruler of the first layer of hell, the archdevil Zariel, is constantly on the lookouts for fresh blood, if you will, for her forces in the Blood War, a cosmic war between law and chaos. As part of some agreement we're not privy to at the moment, Karlach was sold to Zariel and forced to fight in the Blood War. Turns out Karlach was pretty good at this, so Zariel had her heart replaced with an infernal engine that is burning hotter and hotter. This is why sometimes Karlach will be surrounded with literal flames. So her motivations are twofold. She wants to get revenge on the person who sold her to Zariel, on top of dealing with the infernal engine in her chest before it can potentially kill her. On top of the usual intrinsic tie to the rest of the characters through the Mind Flayer tadpole in her skull. The rest of the game also has some important ties to Avernus as well that, again, I'd rather not spoil in a video like this, but the first layer of hell does come up quite a bit when you start digging into the game a little bit. That said though, that is pretty much everything to know about the origin characters ahead of the release of this game. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know down below how you feel about the origin characters, which one you would want to play, do you want to play a custom character, etc, etc. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.